Thanks. Police and protester dialogue. I should say at the outset that I'm focusing on police and protesters, but police obviously have discussions with a whole range of people and groups when there's a protest or industrial dispute that might be taking place. It might be managers, it might be CEOs. Police can be involved in educating private security in terms of the law or what they can do in certain situations. But my focus today is on the police and the protesters. Now, historically, in colonial times and even in the into the 20th century, there was a lot of biff and bash between protesters and police. There was that anonymity of them versus us. Police were often distanced, particularly from local communities, where a lot of the conflicts took place, particularly industrial ones, you know, on the wharves, in the mines, in the shearing sheds. The police were often remote from those areas, and that they came in to try and bring about a solution to a particular situation. So at times there was considerable hostility. I won't go into the details of it. If we jump quickly to the 1960s or so, there was a theory that's been evolved that talks about policing and protest, that it was often one of escalated coercion, particularly in America, the time of race riots, for example. The police always had to be one level or more above that of the protesters, or depending how you looked upon it, the rioters. But then by the 1980s and 1990s, in the Western world, particularly parts of Europe and America, and I think also applying in Australia, you get more an idea of what's termed negotiated management, whereby police and protest groups come together and try and find some sort of ground which will allow the protest to take place, but also police keep control of the situation and keep social order in that situation. And some of the characteristics are on the slide of that negotiation that became certainly far more prominent in the 80s and 90s and resulted in certainly lessening the amount of pitched battles, lessening the amount of outright conflict situations. So police adopted things like minimising of violence tactics. Protest permits were brought in some countries. Some other areas spoke of memorandums of understanding with protest groups. Kent in England was one body that unofficially has today memorandum of understandings with its protesters in that particular county. It was seen as a more softer response, more tolerant under enforcing the law, that demonstrators complied with what police expected. Police were still in control because they're pushing the parameters of what's acceptable in terms of protest behaviour, maybe in times of when the rally is to take place, where, etc. And some groups, particularly in the industrial sphere, have become more and more attuned to policing themselves. Come back to that in a sec. So the idea was to get cooperation between the police and the protesters rather than pitched battles, conflict as such. But at all times, obviously, police maintain their coercive potential to enforce the law, and also they have their riot technology available to use. If we look at a quick case study, which probably many of you are familiar with, the 98 Maritime Union of Australia waterfront dispute. Now, I've argued elsewhere that this was basically conducted in an atmosphere of maintaining the peace between police and the union movement, particularly the MUA, in general terms. There's obviously some exceptions that occurred in Western Australia and elsewhere. But generally, peace was maintained in that dispute because of protocols and because of negotiations and because of liaisons that had been taking place for a decade or more beforehand. Here in Victoria, which was the really litmus test of the whole dispute down at Port Melbourne, the police basically adopted a minimum arrest policy. They had their Victoria Police Industrial Disputation Officer had been involved working with the union movement and individual unions for over 10 years. So there was personal contact, there was liaison, there was some rapport there. So when this dispute really took off at Port Melbourne, you had a joint approach. You had the police, half a dozen senior police who had direct contact with half a dozen senior union officials. And if anything was likely to occur or there were concerns, they had one another's secret phone numbers, whatever. They had daily meetings all the time trying to prevent violence, because really it was in neither the police nor the unions benefit to be involved, to have injured members and to be involved in violent scenes. And the Industrial Disputation Officer, John Winther, summed it up at the end, saying that it was really a successful operation for over 100 days because of the negotiated management that took place between the police and the union movement. Because of that, there were very few arrests, very few injuries in what was an extremely volatile situation in Melbourne and also around 13 other Patrick's terminals in Australia. And a scene there from New South Wales, Botany Bay. I'm a Victorian, so I couldn't put a Victorian slide like this up. But that was probably as bad as it got, mainly that there was pushing and shoving. There was, I think, 180 odd arrests at Botany Bay on a particular day. But again, there was some rapport. There was no pitched battle between one side and the other. It had been because of the rapport, because of the liaisons that have been developing over time. If we move into the 21st century, and we're looking at the policing of demonstrations, particularly anti-globalisation demonstrations on a large scale, like Genoa, Gothenburg, Davos, Seattle, London, Washington. Some of the characteristics of the protesters are that such diverse groups of people. They don't have a fixed agenda, unlike the MUA had to get back on the wharves. It was a set agenda. There are loose alliances, there's unclear lines of command, very hard for police to identify who are the representatives in something like a major anti-globalisation protest. So there's fragmented strategies that these groups can go in all sorts of different ways, and we saw that in the G20 in London in 2009. So what's been termed in some police parlance is the notion of bad demonstrators. They're these sort that are mixed, uncertain, lacking leadership, lacking authority, lacking hierarchy. The good demonstrators are those which have a parallel structure, at least to some degree, with the police, where there is a hierarchy, there are levels, there are people who take responsibility, and that you could see in operation in the 98 Maritime Union dispute. Okay, one example, this time we'll refer to Melbourne. The G20 in 2006, very much over contests for space in the heart of the city. You had certain radical extremist groups like Mutiny and Arterial Bloc who don't involve in dialogue, and police don't involve in dialogue with them. So that's obviously a limitation of this policing and protester dialoguing. You had some very unusual scenes of police cowering behind behind their vans, some damage done to police vehicles, and even for a short time part of the CBD was in the hands of the extremist element of the protest. And I mention that G20 mainly as a result that probably talk or dialogue was probably impossible in that situation. And neither side saw it as possible as a result of it. And when you get that situation, they're always open to surprises. Of course, police don't know what the protesters are going to do or part of the protest are going to get up to. And on the other side, the protesters haven't got limits or parameters in which to operate. that have been put there in place by the police. Climate camps. Just going to look at 3 quick case studies of the policing of climate camps, which is a fairly recent phenomena, probably are less prominent in Australia than what they certainly are in parts of Europe or Britain. The first one, it wasn't the first, it was about the 3rd or 4th one that occurred in England. It's an annual event, or was an annual event in England, was at Kent, at Kings North Power Station. And the slogan was, "Shut down Kings North." It was an aggressive rhetoric with the purpose of stopping, shutting down that particular coal-fired power station. Because the company, E.ON, were going to build, or wanting to build, a second power station on the Medway estuary there in Kent. And the campers were made up of affinity, cell-like groups, eccentric combinations, ranging from anarchists to Baptists to whatever, in this protest. Now, mainly concerned with the dialogue. Now, in this particular case, the Kent police were responsible for the operation, though they employed, or also deployed with it, was police from 26 other police agencies in England, as well as the Met. Now, the Kent police in Operation Oasis had ongoing discussions prior to this protest. Everybody knew when it was going to happen and where. But one nice little story, I think, about how this dialogue sometimes can be a bit ritualistic. But this story, I think, brings home that point that when they were talking about discussing where the protesters would camp, the protesters said, "We want to be outside the front of the power station, naturally, and on the Saturday we're going to invade the power station, shut down Kings North." But what the police said, "Oh no, better not do that. That tree line area is an area of scientific value and also some archaeological value." And the protesters, being good environmentalists, said, "All right, we won't camp in front of the power station, where we'd be from here to the end of the room away, ready to move on a Saturday. We'll camp on a farmer's land 3 kilometres away." So it's just part of the sort of dialogue and the games that can take place. Operation Oasis was a huge operation in England because it's involving infrastructure, vital infrastructure, and connected to the power grid in England. Now, although there was not full agreement, and no memorandum of understanding gained with the climate campers, I think there was still some value in the dialogue that took place beforehand. On the actual day of action, the Saturday, it's strongly argued and came out in 3 reports since that the police stuffed up, if you like. They made tactical errors. The police had agreed that the campers on the Saturday could march to the power plant and stand in front and wave placards and chant and whatever. But while they were marching there, a police officer in a helicopter above told the police officers below to disperse them on the route. So they didn't keep that fairly informal agreement that had been made. And then the police went in full riot gear, and 8,000 were searched within 2 days. Not just the campers, but any locals who walked in and out of the area as well. So as a result of the breakdown of that agreement and the subsequent, particularly searches that took place, there were 3 inquiries into the policing of Kings North, and some months later, 6 months or so later, you have the much bigger protest, the G20 of 40,000 in London, when Ian Tomlinson, the newspaper vendor, was killed. And there was another 4 major inquiries after that. And the lessons that came out of all those inquiries was that you need more extensive dialogue. It needs to be ongoing between the police and the protesters. Any arrangements made need to be honoured unless there are exceptional circumstances apply, and whenever possible, better to have an unobtrusive police presence in that. Okay, the second climate camp, which I witnessed firsthand, was 12 months later, and because of all the things that had happened at Kings North, and also you had a major event of the G20 protest, the climate camp in September 2009 held at Blackheath was very different in nature. There was no threat to infrastructure. It was a training camp for activists. It was held on common land. It was a symbolic location of a former peasants' protest. There was open police dialogue. And you had a different command in charge. You had Superintendent Julia Pendry and another female commander who ran the policing operation for this annual climate camp event. And one of the things that happened was 4 days before the camp was due to start, and no one knew where it was going to be until 20 minutes before the tweet, which were the emails and whatever went round. But 4 days before, 4 members of the protest group went to the Metropolitan Police Service Training Centre in Graveshead, and they were given very open information about the tactics police were going to use, their intentions, the roles that were going to be played. They were even given a tour of this training centre for riot police in England. And once the camp was established, and there was over 1,000 activists there virtually all the time, there was a daily meeting between the police commander, Julia Pendry, and one of the media liaison people from the climate camp diverse groups. In terms of dialogue, again, there's ritualistic aspects to it, but still a lot of relationships are built up there at the same time as well, which are helpful in easing conflict situations. There was actually very limited surveillance at Blackheath. The protesters themselves talked about the under-policing. All there was a cherry picker over the road with a surveillance camera there. So different from the mass saturation that occurred 12 months before at Kings North, though they're very, very different contexts, the two climate camps. And from the two little diagrams I had on the previous slide, the protesters themselves set up their fencing to keep the police out, and the police remained outside. And very, very little police presence. In 2 days, I only saw one police person in the vicinity. Okay, if I very quickly talk about closer to home, Hazelwood, 2.5 hours down the road in Latrobe Valley, in the coal belt, arguably Victoria's polluting dinosaur, as it's been described. This was the first climate camp in Victoria. Just get on to the discussions. They've been going on for 3 months prior to the actual camp, though in this case it was a weekend at Hazelwood, near Morwell. And in all these cases to do with climate campers, the liaison teams act as conduits, as messengers. They don't claim any representative nature. They're not claim any authority, because they just say, we'll take the messages back that the police give us. It's up to our consensus and meeting group to decide whether or not we accept those or not. So it makes it difficult for police to get a definite answer or a firm commitment on how the protesters may act. Police get a lot of their information through open source material. A lot of the negotiations are a bit of a game, like how many protesters are going to be, and then on the other side, are you going to bring the horses and the dogs with you, and all this sort of thing, trying to find out information. But still, they're talking, and boundaries are set of what is acceptable behaviour, and it's doing away with a lot of the potential surprises. And to quote Louise Miller, a climate camp legal advisor, it's akin to smoke and mirrors chess game. We've spoken to you, you've spoken to us. We've played friendly. On the day, how much of what you've committed to, will you stand by? The same applies to our side. And Graveshead in the Met in England, talking about the training head there, Dean Higgins, if it's a peaceful event, we'll facilitate it, even if there's some disruption. Superintendent Neville Taylor, who was then in charge of the Latrobe Valley area, talking about the real importance is, or can be, post-event. You know, it's important before and during the event, the negotiations and discussions and dialogue, but after the event is very important because there you really consolidate some sort of relationship or other. A dilemma for police is obviously police generally prepare for the worst case scenario, yet in terms of protests they're meant to facilitate protest. So there can be a tension there. And obviously some other limitations there. And the suspicion will always remain one side or the other. Yet I'd sum up by saying dialogue is important, even if not fully successful, throughout the event. The greater understanding on both sides. And dialogue sets up protocols, limits the surprises, and provides context for accommodating a peaceful protest as such. I'll just skip those two and just finally mention perhaps the par excellence of this dialogue policing is in Sweden, where in Stockholm they wear yellow vests and actually mingle among the crowd. They help the crowd to police their own protest. There's an educational aspect to it. It's going some steps further as such. And as one sergeant in the Swedish police said to me a couple of months ago, how do you evaluate it? Well, there has been a formal evaluation of sorts done, but she claimed, the sergeant, as a dialogue Swedish policewoman, that the ability to walk amidst anarchists. If you can walk around with anarchists and they'll say hello to you and you say hello to them, you know that you're sort of on the right track of keeping the protest how you within bounds, but also facilitating that protest. Okay, thanks very much.